What if everything you thought you knew about the crucifixion was just the beginning of the story? What if the resurrection account that billions have heard for 2,000 years was deliberately incomplete, stripped of its most terrifying and magnificent details? Tonight, we're venturing into territory that religious authorities have kept sealed for nearly 2 millennia. We're about to uncover a gospel so controversial and shocking in its revelations that it was banned, buried, and erased from Christian history. This isn't speculation or theory. This is documented historical fact about a text that dared to tell the story of Christ's final hours in ways that would shake the foundations of everything you believe. My name is, well, it doesn't matter for now. What matters is that I'm here on this channel because I believe truth shouldn't be locked away in dusty archives or buried beneath centuries of religious politics. And if you're here, if something drew you to click on this video, then you're ready to discover what they didn't want you to know about the most pivotal moment in human history. But before we dive into the forbidden depths of this lost gospel, I need you to understand something crucial. What you're about to discover isn't just ancient history. It's a revelation that speaks directly to questions that have long haunted believers and skeptics alike. Questions about what really happened on that cross. Questions about what the witnesses truly saw. Questions about why certain accounts were preserved while others were systematically destroyed. So, if you're ready to explore the shadows behind the most famous story ever told, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Because what we're about to uncover is just the first layer of a mystery that goes deeper than most people are prepared to follow. Now, let's talk about what you think you know about the crucifixion and resurrection. You've heard the familiar accounts from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know about the crown of thorns, the journey to Golgotha, the darkness that fell over the land. You've heard about the tomb, the stone, the women who came at dawn to find it empty. These are the stories that shaped Christianity, that formed the foundation of faith for billions of souls across 2,000 years. But here's what they never told you in Sunday school. There was another gospel, another witness, another account that claimed to reveal what really happened during those earth-shattering hours. And this account didn't just fill in missing details. It completely transformed the entire narrative in ways that would have revolutionized Christianity itself, if it had been allowed to survive. This is the Gospel of Peter. Not Peter the fisherman who became an apostle, but a text attributed to him that emerged in the early Christian world and then vanished into darkness. For over 1,500 years, this gospel existed only in fragments and references, whispered about in scholarly circles but never fully understood, until 1886, when archaeologists made a discovery in an ancient Egyptian tomb that would change everything we thought we knew about early Christian literature. Hidden within the burial wrappings of a monk, carefully preserved against time and persecution, lay a nearly complete copy of this forbidden gospel. When scholars first began translating the ancient Greek text, they couldn't believe what they were reading. This wasn't just another version of the familiar Passion narrative. This was something entirely different. Something that challenged not just the details of Christ's death and resurrection, but the very nature of what those events meant for humanity. The Gospel of Peter doesn't begin where the canonical Gospels begin. It doesn't start with Jesus' birth or ministry or teachings. It opens in the middle of the trial before Pilate, as if the author assumed you already knew the background story and wanted to focus entirely on what happened during those final, crucial hours. But from the very first lines, you can sense that this account is going to take you places the familiar Gospels never dared to go. The language is different, more vivid, more graphic, more unsettling. Where the canonical Gospels often describe events with restraint and theological purpose, the Gospel of Peter reads like an eyewitness account from someone who was there. someone who saw things that others missed or chose not to record, someone who was determined to preserve every horrifying and magnificent detail, no matter how shocking or difficult to believe. Consider how the canonical Gospels handle the crucifixion itself. They tell us Jesus was nailed to the cross, that he spoke 7 final words, that darkness fell over the land, and that he died crying out to God. These are powerful moments, certainly, but they're presented with a kind of reverent distance, as if the authors were protecting readers from the full brutality and cosmic significance of what was really happening. The Gospel of Peter takes no such protective approach. Here, the crucifixion becomes a cosmic battle between light and darkness, between divine power and human cruelty, played out in terms so vivid and supernatural that early church authorities couldn't decide whether it was profound revelation or dangerous heresy. The text describes not just physical suffering, but spiritual warfare on a scale that dwarfs human understanding. But perhaps most shocking of all is what this gospel claims happened during the resurrection itself. The canonical Gospels tell us about an empty tomb discovered by women at dawn. They describe appearances of the risen Christ to his disciples. They speak of doubt transformed into faith, of a victory over death that would echo through eternity. These are beautiful, powerful accounts that have inspired countless generations. But the Gospel of Peter claims to describe the resurrection as it was actually happening. Not the discovery of an empty tomb, but the moment of emergence itself. Not just the aftermath of divine victory, but the cosmic event as it unfolded in real time. And what it describes is so extraordinary, so far beyond anything in the canonical accounts, that you can understand why religious authorities decided it was too dangerous to preserve. Picture this scene as the Gospel of Peter presents it. It's still night, hours before the women would arrive at the tomb. Roman soldiers stand guard, making sure no one can steal the body or create false stories about resurrection. Suddenly, the sky begins to change. Not the gradual lightening of dawn, but something else entirely. Something that makes the guards look up in terror and amazement. 2 figures descend from heaven. Not angels as we typically imagine them, but beings of such radiance and power that the soldiers can barely look upon them. These beings approach the sealed tomb, and at their presence, the massive stone rolls away by itself. Not pushed by human hands, not moved by earthly force, but responding to a command from realms beyond the physical world. But this is just the beginning of what the Gospel of Peter claims the guards witnessed. Because what emerged from that tomb wasn't simply the figure of Jesus, as we might expect from the canonical accounts. According to this forbidden gospel, what came forth was something so magnificent and terrifying that it challenged every assumption about the nature of resurrection itself. The text describes Jesus emerging from the tomb, but not alone. He's supported by the 2 heavenly beings, and here's where the account becomes almost impossible to comprehend. The Gospel of Peter states that Jesus' head reached above the clouds. Not metaphorically, but literally. The risen Christ had become a cosmic figure whose very physical presence bridged earth and heaven in ways that defied normal understanding. Think about the implications of such a description. This isn't just resurrection as return to life. This is transformation into something entirely new, something that transcends the boundaries between human and divine, between earthly and celestial existence. The Gospel of Peter suggests that what happened in that tomb wasn't simply the revival of a dead body, but the birth of a new form of existence that had never been seen before. And then, as if this vision wasn't shocking enough, the text describes something that has puzzled scholars and believers for over a century. Following behind this cosmic figure of the risen Christ comes another presence, something that speaks, something that participates in this moment of ultimate triumph. According to the Gospel of Peter, the cross itself emerges from the tomb, walking and speaking like a living being. Let that image settle in your mind for a moment, a cross that speaks, an instrument of execution transformed into a witness of resurrection, the very symbol of death becoming a herald of eternal life. When early church authorities read this description, they didn't know whether they were encountering the most profound spiritual revelation ever recorded or the most dangerous heretical fantasy ever conceived. But the cross doesn't just walk in this account, it speaks. And what it says, according to this forbidden gospel, is a declaration that would have revolutionized Christian understanding of salvation itself. The cross proclaims that the gospel has been preached not just to the living, but to the dead, that the victory achieved through crucifixion extends not just to future generations, but backward through time to every soul that had ever lived and died without hope of redemption. This single statement contains theological implications that would have shattered the religious framework of the early Christian world. If the dead could receive the gospel, if salvation could reach backward through time, if the cross itself had become a living witness to cosmic redemption, then everything about the nature of divine justice, human destiny, and eternal purpose would need to be reconsidered. Now you begin to understand why this gospel was banned. Not because it was obviously false or clearly heretical, but because it was too profound, too revolutionary, too transformative to be safely integrated into the religious institutions that were trying to establish themselves in the ancient world. The Gospel of Peter didn't just offer a different version of familiar events. It suggested that those events were far more cosmic and far-reaching than anyone had imagined. But the suppression of this gospel wasn't immediate or simple. For the first few centuries of Christian history, the Gospel of Peter circulated alongside other early Christian writings. Some communities accepted it as authentic apostolic teaching. Others questioned its authority but still found value in its insights. The debate wasn't settled quickly or easily. What finally led to its condemnation wasn't necessarily theological disagreement, but institutional necessity. As Christianity grew from a small Jewish sect into a major religious movement spanning the Roman Empire, church leaders needed clear boundaries, definitive doctrines, authorized texts. The wild cosmic vision of the Gospel of Peter didn't fit neatly into the systematic theology that emerging church institutions required. So this gospel was gradually marginalized, then actively suppressed, then finally lost to history. The communities that preserved it were scattered or absorbed into more orthodox congregations. The manuscripts were allowed to decay or were actively destroyed. Within a few centuries, the Gospel of Peter existed only in fragmentary quotations and hostile references from church authorities who wanted to explain why it should be rejected. But here's what those early church leaders couldn't have anticipated. They couldn't foresee that 1,500 years later, archaeologists would dig this gospel out of an Egyptian tomb. They couldn't imagine that modern scholars would have the tools and freedom to study it without the political and institutional pressures that shaped the early church. They couldn't predict that we would live in an age when forbidden questions could be asked openly, when suppressed texts could be examined critically, when the full complexity of early Christian thought could finally be explored. And so here we are, in possession of a gospel that was meant to be lost forever, reading accounts that were deemed too dangerous for previous generations, encountering visions of resurrection that challenge everything we thought we knew about the most important event in human history. But this raises the most crucial question of all. If the Gospel of Peter was suppressed because it was false, why does it contain details that align so remarkably with other early Christian traditions that survived independently? If it was condemned because it was heretical, why do its core theological insights appear in various forms throughout Christian mystical literature? If it was rejected because it was too fantastic to be believed, why does its cosmic vision of resurrection actually solve some of the theological puzzles that have plagued Christianity for 2,000 years? These are the questions we'll be exploring as we dive deeper into this forbidden gospel. Because what we've uncovered tonight is just the surface layer of a mystery that challenges everything about how we understand the cross, the resurrection, and the ultimate meaning of human existence itself. The evidence doesn't stop there. Because when we dig deeper into the Gospel of Peter, we discover something that should make every biblical scholar reconsider everything they thought they knew about early Christian witnesses. This forbidden gospel doesn't just claim to record extraordinary events. It presents them with a level of specific detail that suggests either incredible imagination or direct eyewitness testimony. Consider how the canonical Gospels handle the moment of death on the cross. They tell us that Jesus cried out and gave up his spirit. They mention the darkness that fell over the land, the tearing of the temple veil. These are powerful theological statements, but they maintain a certain reverent distance from the physical reality of what was happening. The Gospel of Peter takes us inside that moment in ways that are almost unbearable to read. It describes not just the physical agony, but the cosmic battle being waged in the spiritual realm while Jesus hung between heaven and earth. The text claims that as Christ's life ebbed away, the very foundations of reality began to shake. Not just earthquakes or natural phenomena, but the boundaries between dimensions starting to collapse. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. According to this banned gospel, the soldiers and witnesses didn't just see a man dying on a cross. They saw something that challenged their understanding of what death itself actually meant. The Gospel of Peter describes Jesus' final breath not as an ending, but as a doorway opening between worlds that had been sealed since the fall of humanity. Think about the psychological impact of such a claim. If this account is accurate, then the crucifixion wasn't just a sacrifice for human sin. It was a cosmic key unlocking realms that had been closed to human experience for millennia. The cross became a bridge between dimensions, and everyone present became unwilling witnesses to the most significant moment in the history of consciousness itself. The guards, according to this forbidden text, weren't just watching an execution. They were observing the moment when eternity invaded time, when the invisible became visible, when the spiritual realm crashed into physical reality with such force that the very structure of existence was forever altered. No wonder they fled in terror when the resurrection began. They weren't just afraid of supernatural events. They were confronted with evidence that everything they understood about life, death, and reality was fundamentally incomplete. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Gospel of Peter's account isn't what it says about the crucifixion or resurrection. It's what it reveals about the nature of divine justice itself. Because buried within this forbidden narrative is a theological concept so radical that it would have destroyed the entire framework of religious authority in the ancient world. Remember what we discussed about the cross-speaking, about the proclamation that the gospel had been preached to the dead? This wasn't just a poetic metaphor or symbolic language. According to the Gospel of Peter, this was a literal description of what the witnesses heard. The cross itself had become a herald, announcing that the victory achieved through crucifixion extended beyond the boundaries of linear time. What does this mean practically? It suggests that every soul who had ever lived and died without knowledge of Christ suddenly had access to redemption. That the thief on the cross wasn't the only one offered paradise in that moment. That the spiritual realm was flooded with the possibility of salvation for countless generations who had lived and died in darkness, waiting for a light they never knew was coming. The implications are staggering. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then the crucifixion didn't just provide salvation for future believers. It retroactively transformed the eternal destiny of every human soul that had ever existed. The cross became a cosmic reset button, offering second chances to those who never had first chances, extending hope to the hopeless across all of human history. Now you understand why early church authorities were terrified of this gospel. Not because it was obviously false, but because it was too generous, too inclusive, too transformative. If salvation could reach backward through time, if the dead could receive the gospel, if divine mercy extended beyond the grave itself, then what need was there for religious institutions to control access to God? What purpose did priestly mediation serve if the cross itself had become the ultimate mediator? The Gospel of Peter didn't just challenge specific doctrines. It threatened to make the entire structure of organized religion obsolete by suggesting that divine love was far more radical and far-reaching than any human institution could contain or control. But the suppression of this gospel reveals something even more disturbing about how religious truth gets determined. Because the decision to exclude the Gospel of Peter from the biblical canon wasn't made based purely on theological considerations. It was influenced by political necessity, institutional survival, and the need to maintain authority over increasingly diverse Christian communities scattered across the Roman Empire. Church leaders in the 4th and 5th centuries faced an impossible choice. They could preserve texts like the Gospel of Peter that offered profound spiritual insights but challenged institutional authority. Or they could establish clear doctrinal boundaries that would unify the church but potentially exclude authentic apostolic traditions that didn't fit the emerging Orthodox framework. They chose institutional unity over theological diversity. They chose manageable truth over transformative mystery. They chose the safety of controlled doctrine over the wild possibilities suggested by texts like the Gospel of Peter, and in making those choices, they shaped Christianity for the next 2,000 years in ways they couldn't have fully understood. But here's what those early church authorities couldn't have anticipated. They couldn't foresee that we would eventually develop historical methods sophisticated enough to trace the suppression of texts like this. They couldn't imagine that we would have access to archaeological discoveries that would resurrect gospels they thought they had buried forever. They couldn't predict that we would live in an age when forbidden questions could be asked openly, when suppressed texts could be studied without fear of persecution. And so we find ourselves in a unique position in human history. We have access to the Gospel of Peter, but we also understand why it was suppressed. We can read its shocking claims about giant resurrection figures and speaking crosses, but we can also analyze them within the broader context of early Christian theological development. We can appreciate its profound insights about cosmic redemption, while also recognizing the institutional challenges it would have created. This puts us in the uncomfortable position of having to decide what to do with forbidden knowledge. Do we simply treat the Gospel of Peter as an interesting historical curiosity, a fascinating glimpse into the diversity of early Christian thought? Do we dismiss it as obviously legendary, too fantastic to be taken seriously as a historical source? Or do we grapple with the possibility that it preserves authentic apostolic traditions that were suppressed not because they were false, but because they were too true to be safely contained within human institutions? The answer isn't simple, because the Gospel of Peter forces us to confront questions that go far beyond historical scholarship or theological debate. It challenges us to consider whether our understanding of the most important events in human history has been deliberately limited, whether the familiar gospel accounts we've inherited represent the full truth, or just the manageable portions of a reality too vast and radical for institutional Christianity to embrace. Consider the psychological impact of reading the Gospel of Peter after a lifetime of familiarity with the canonical Gospels. It's like discovering that a story you thought you knew completely actually had entire chapters that were hidden from you. It's like realizing that the most significant events in human history were even more extraordinary than you were ever allowed to imagine. It's like finding out that divine love and cosmic redemption operate on scales that dwarf everything you were taught to believe possible. But it also raises disturbing questions about authority and truth. If the Gospel of Peter was suppressed despite containing authentic apostolic traditions, what other texts were lost? What other insights into the nature of divine reality were deemed too dangerous for public consumption? How much of early Christian understanding was sacrificed on the altar of institutional necessity? These aren't just academic questions. They're existential challenges that force us to reconsider our relationship to religious authority, biblical interpretation, and the very nature of divine revelation itself. Because if the Gospel of Peter is even partially authentic, then the familiar boundaries between orthodox and heretical, canonical and apocryphal, acceptable and forbidden, begin to blur in ways that are both liberating and terrifying. The text itself seems aware of the controversy it would create. Unlike the canonical Gospels, which often present events with theological interpretation already built in, the Gospel of Peter reads more like raw testimony. It describes what the witnesses saw without always explaining what it meant. It presents cosmic events without reducing them to manageable doctrinal categories. It offers visions of resurrection that expand rather than limit our understanding of divine possibility. This approach makes the Gospel of Peter both more challenging and more authentic than many early Christian texts. It doesn't try to make the extraordinary events it describes fit neatly into existing theological frameworks. Instead, it forces readers to expand their frameworks to accommodate realities that transcend normal human experience. It suggests that the truth about the crucifixion and resurrection is not just more complex than we've been taught, but more magnificent and more terrifying than human language can adequately express. And perhaps that's why this gospel was ultimately banned, not because it was heretical, but because it was too authentic. Not because it was false, but because it was too true to be safely integrated into the religious institutions of its time. Not because it undermined faith, but because it revealed that faith itself was far more radical and transformative than most believers were prepared to embrace. The cosmic vision presented in the Gospel of Peter suggests that the familiar story of crucifixion and resurrection was just the visible surface of spiritual realities that operate on scales beyond human comprehension. That what appeared to be a localized historical event was actually a cosmic transformation that affected every dimension of existence across all of time. That the cross didn't just provide individual salvation, but restructured the entire spiritual architecture of reality itself. These are dangerous ideas, not because they're false, but because they're too large for human institutions to contain. They suggest that divine love operates according to principles that transcend the boundaries religious authorities need to maintain order and control. They imply that cosmic redemption might be far more generous and far-reaching than any human organization could safely acknowledge without undermining its own authority. But they're also liberating ideas, because they suggest that the most important truths about existence aren't locked away behind institutional barriers or limited to those with proper theological credentials. They imply that the cosmic events described in the Gospel of Peter are still accessible to anyone willing to look beyond familiar interpretations and encounter the wild, transformative reality of divine love, operating on scales that dwarf human understanding. The question that emerges from our exploration of this forbidden gospel isn't whether we should believe every detail of its extraordinary claims. The question is whether we're willing to consider that the truth about the most significant events in human history might be far more wonderful and far more challenging than we've been allowed to imagine. Because hidden within the Gospel of Peter's shocking descriptions of giant resurrection figures and speaking crosses lies something that could revolutionize our understanding of divine purpose and human destiny. Something that early church authorities recognized as too dangerous to preserve, but too profound to be completely forgotten. The gospel that was meant to be lost forever has been found. The text that was banned for being too radical has been recovered. The vision that was deemed too dangerous for previous generations is now available for us to examine without the political and institutional pressures that shaped early Christianity. What we do with this opportunity will determine whether we remain content with manageable versions of divine truth, or whether we're willing to encounter the wild, cosmic reality that the Gospel of Peter claims lies at the heart of Christian faith itself. But the most disturbing revelation in the Gospel of Peter isn't what it tells us about the resurrection. It's what it reveals about the nature of death itself. Because according to this forbidden text, what happened on that cross wasn't just the death of a man. It was the death of death. The canonical Gospels tell us that Jesus died and was buried. Simple, straightforward, theological. But the Gospel of Peter describes the moment of death as a cosmic shattering. The text claims that when Christ breathed his last breath, the spiritual realm didn't just observe his passing. It convulsed. Reality itself began to unravel and rebuild simultaneously. Think about what this means. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then every person who has ever faced death, every soul who has ever wondered what lies beyond the grave, every human being who has ever feared the ultimate unknown was witnessing the moment when that unknown was being transformed forever. The text describes the hours between crucifixion and resurrection not as peaceful rest in a tomb, but as cosmic warfare. While Jesus' body lay still, his spirit was allegedly descending into realms that had been sealed since the beginning of time. Places where the dead had waited in darkness, where souls had lingered without hope, where the very concept of redemption had never penetrated. And here's where the Gospel of Peter becomes truly revolutionary. It doesn't just claim that Jesus visited these realms. It suggests he conquered them, that he didn't simply preach to the dead, but liberated them, that he didn't just offer salvation to future believers, but retroactively redeemed every soul that had ever lived and died without hope. Picture the scene as this forbidden gospel presents it. The underworld itself becomes a battlefield. Spiritual forces that had ruled over human souls since the fall of mankind suddenly find themselves confronted with divine authority they cannot resist. Chains that had bound the dead for millennia begin to shatter. Darkness that had seemed eternal starts to crack, as light invades realms that had never known illumination. But this cosmic battle wasn't silent or invisible. According to the Gospel of Peter, it created tremors that reached into the physical world. The earthquakes mentioned in the canonical accounts weren't just geological phenomena. They were the physical manifestation of spiritual warfare on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. The guards at the tomb weren't just watching over a dead body, they were unknowingly stationed at the epicenter of a cosmic revolution. And when that revolution reached its climax, when victory was secured in realms beyond their comprehension, reality itself began to shift in ways that would terrify anyone who witnessed it. This is why the resurrection described in the Gospel of Peter is so radically different from the familiar accounts. It wasn't just the return of Jesus to life. It was the emergence of something entirely new. A being who had conquered death not just for himself, but for every soul that had ever existed. Someone who had literally restructured the spiritual architecture of existence itself. The giant figure emerging from the tomb wasn't just a resurrected man. According to this banned text, it was the first representative of a new form of existence, a preview of what every human soul could become when death itself had been defeated. A cosmic announcement that the rules governing life, death, and eternity had been fundamentally rewritten. And the speaking cross wasn't just a miraculous event, it was a herald proclaiming the most revolutionary news in the history of consciousness. That redemption wasn't limited by time, space, or even death itself. That divine love had proven more powerful than every force that had ever separated souls from their Creator. That salvation had become as universal as mortality had once been, Now you understand why early church authorities couldn't allow this gospel to survive in its original form. It wasn't just challenging specific doctrines about resurrection. It was announcing that the entire framework of religious authority had been rendered obsolete by cosmic events too magnificent for any human institution to contain. If the gospel of Peter was accurate, then priests weren't necessary because the cross itself had become the ultimate mediator. Churches weren't required because the spiritual realm had been opened to direct access. Theological interpretation wasn't needed because the dead themselves had witnessed divine truth firsthand. The implications were staggering and dangerous, because if salvation could reach backward through time to redeem souls who had died before Christ, then what about forward through time? What about people who would live and die without ever hearing the gospel message? What about those who would reject Christianity but still carry the divine image within their souls? The Gospel of Peter seemed to suggest that divine mercy operated on scales and according to principles that transcended every human attempt to limit, control, or define it. That cosmic love was far more radical and far-reaching than any religious institution could safely acknowledge without undermining its own authority. But here's what makes this even more unsettling. The Gospel of Peter doesn't present these revolutionary ideas as theological speculation. It claims to record them as eyewitness testimony, as actual events observed by real people who were present during the most significant moments in human history. The text reads like a police report from the scene of a cosmic crime. Detailed, specific, unflinching in its description of events that challenge every assumption about the nature of reality itself. It doesn't try to make the extraordinary seem normal or the supernatural seem manageable. It simply presents what allegedly happened and leaves readers to grapple with the implications. This approach makes the Gospel of Peter both more credible and more disturbing than many early Christian texts, because it suggests that the familiar gospel accounts we've inherited might have been sanitized versions of events too shocking for mass consumption. That the truth about the crucifixion and resurrection was deliberately toned down to make it more palatable to religious institutions trying to establish themselves in the ancient world. Consider what this means for how we understand the development of Christian doctrine. If the Gospel of Peter preserves authentic apostolic traditions that were suppressed for institutional rather than theological reasons, then the Christianity we've inherited might represent a compromise between divine truth and human limitations, rather than the full revelation of God's cosmic plan. The text itself seems to anticipate this problem. Unlike other early Christian writings that often include interpretive frameworks or theological explanations, the Gospel of Peter presents its extraordinary claims with minimal commentary. It describes what the witnesses allegedly saw without always explaining what it meant. It offers visions of cosmic transformation without reducing them to manageable doctrinal categories. This raw, unfiltered approach makes the gospel both more challenging and more authentic than many religious texts. It forces readers to expand their understanding rather than confirming existing beliefs. It suggests that divine reality might be far more complex and magnificent than human language can adequately express or human institutions can safely contain. But it also raises disturbing questions about the relationship between spiritual truth and religious authority. Because if the Gospel of Peter was suppressed despite containing authentic revelations about the most important events in human history, then what other truths have been buried beneath centuries of institutional control? The archaeological discovery of this gospel in 1886 wasn't just the recovery of an ancient text. It was the resurrection of questions that religious authorities thought they had settled forever. Questions about the nature of divine revelation, the limits of institutional authority, and the possibility that cosmic truth might be far more radical than any human organization can safely acknowledge. These questions become even more urgent when we examine the specific details that distinguish the Gospel of Peter from canonical accounts. Because the differences aren't just matters of emphasis or perspective. They're fundamental disagreements about the nature of reality itself. The canonical Gospels present resurrection as victory over death. The Gospel of Peter suggests it was the transformation of death into a gateway to previously unimaginable forms of existence. The familiar accounts describe Jesus appearing to his disciples after rising from the dead. This forbidden gospel claims that what emerged from the tomb was something so magnificent that ordinary human consciousness could barely comprehend it. The implications extend far beyond theological debate into realms of personal, spiritual experience. Because if the Gospel of Peter is even partially accurate, then every assumption about life, death, and human destiny needs to be reconsidered. The familiar boundaries between natural and supernatural, possible and impossible, earthly and cosmic, begin to dissolve in ways that are both liberating and terrifying. This is why the text remains controversial even today, not because scholars have proven it false, but because its claims are so extraordinary that accepting them would require rebuilding our entire understanding of spiritual reality from the ground up. It challenges not just specific religious doctrines, but the very categories we use to think about divine action in the world. The Gospel of Peter forces us to confront the possibility that the most important events in human history were even more cosmic and transformative than we've been taught to believe. That the familiar stories of crucifixion and resurrection were just the visible surface of spiritual realities operating on scales beyond human comprehension. That what appeared to be localized historical events were actually cosmic transformations, affecting every dimension of existence across all of time. But perhaps the most challenging aspect of this forbidden gospel isn't what it claims about ancient events. It's what it suggests about present possibilities. Because if the cosmic transformation described in the Gospel of Peter actually occurred, if death itself was defeated and the spiritual realm was open to direct access, then those realities should still be accessible to anyone willing to look beyond familiar interpretations. The text implies that the extraordinary events it describes weren't limited to a specific historical moment. They were the beginning of an ongoing transformation that would continue until every soul had been offered the redemption that was won through cosmic victory over death itself. The giant figure emerging from the tomb wasn't just Jesus returning to life. It was the first glimpse of what every human being could become when the full implications of resurrection were finally realized. This perspective transforms the Gospel of Peter from ancient history into contemporary spiritual possibility, because if its claims are true, then the cosmic events it describes are still unfolding. The spiritual warfare it depicts is still being waged. The redemption it announces is still being offered to souls across time and space who have never heard the familiar gospel message, but who carry within themselves the divine image that makes salvation possible. The speaking cross becomes more than just a miraculous event from the distant past. It becomes an ongoing proclamation that divine love operates according to principles far more generous and far-reaching than any human institution has been willing to acknowledge. A cosmic announcement that redemption extends beyond every boundary that religious authorities have tried to establish. But accepting this perspective requires more than just intellectual assent to extraordinary claims. It demands a fundamental reorientation of how we understand the relationship between divine reality and human experience. It challenges us to consider that spiritual truth might be far more accessible and far more transformative than we've been taught to believe. The Gospel of Peter suggests that the cosmic temple isn't limited to specific religious institutions or particular theological interpretations. It implies that divine presence operates throughout creation in ways that transcend every human attempt to contain or control it. that the victory achieved through crucifixion and resurrection has opened possibilities for direct spiritual encounter that don't depend on religious mediation or institutional approval. These are dangerous ideas because they threaten the foundation of organized religion's authority over spiritual experience. They suggest that the most important truths about existence might be accessible to anyone willing to look beyond familiar frameworks and encounter the wild, transformative reality of cosmic love operating on scales that dwarf human understanding. But they're also liberating ideas because they imply that every human soul carries within itself the capacity for direct relationship with divine reality. That the cosmic events described in the Gospel of Peter have made it possible for ordinary people to experience extraordinary spiritual transformation without requiring permission from religious authorities or conformity to institutional expectations. The question that emerges from our exploration of this forbidden gospel isn't whether we should believe every detail of its extraordinary claims. The question is whether we're willing to consider that the truth about the most significant events in human history might be far more wonderful and far more challenging than we've been allowed to imagine. Because hidden within the Gospel of Peter's shocking descriptions of cosmic resurrection and speaking crosses lies something that could revolutionize our understanding of human destiny and divine purpose. Something that early church authorities recognized as too dangerous to preserve, but too profound to be completely destroyed. The text that was banned for being too radical has been recovered. The vision that was deemed too dangerous for previous generations is now available for examination without the political pressures that shaped early Christianity. The gospel that was meant to be lost forever has emerged from an Egyptian tomb to challenge everything we thought we knew about the most pivotal moment in human history. What we choose to do with this recovered revelation will determine whether we remain content with manageable versions of spiritual truth, or whether we're prepared to encounter the cosmic reality that the Gospel of Peter claims lies at the very heart of divine love itself. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of our exploration tonight isn't what the Gospel of Peter reveals about ancient events. It's what it suggests about how those events should be affecting us right now, in this moment, as you sit here listening to these forbidden words. Because, according to this banned text, the cosmic transformation it describes wasn't a one-time historical occurrence that we simply remember or celebrate. It was the beginning of an ongoing process that was meant to revolutionize human consciousness forever. The giant figure emerging from that tomb wasn't just Jesus returning to life. It was the first manifestation of what every human soul was destined to become. Think about that for a moment. The Gospel of Peter suggests that what the guards witnessed wasn't just a miracle to be admired from a distance. It was a preview of transformation that was meant to be personally experienced by anyone willing to embrace the cosmic reality that had been unleashed through crucifixion and resurrection. This is where the forbidden gospel becomes not just historically fascinating, but spiritually dangerous, because it implies that the familiar boundaries between human and divine, earthly and celestial, mortal and immortal, were never meant to be permanent barriers. They were temporary limitations that cosmic love had already begun to dissolve. The speaking cross wasn't just announcing that the gospel had been preached to the dead. According to this suppressed text, it was proclaiming that death itself had been transformed from an ending into a doorway. That every soul who had ever faced the ultimate unknown was now being offered passage into realities they could never have imagined. But here's what makes this vision even more revolutionary. The Gospel of Peter doesn't present cosmic transformation as something that requires special religious credentials or institutional approval. It describes it as the natural inheritance of anyone who carries the divine image. Anyone who was created for relationship with the eternal. Anyone who has ever sensed that they were made for more than mere biological existence. This perspective completely overturns the traditional religious framework that most people have inherited. Instead of needing to earn divine favor through proper beliefs or behaviors, the Gospel of Peter suggests that cosmic redemption has already been achieved on behalf of every soul that has ever existed. The question isn't whether you qualify for transformation. The question is whether you're willing to accept the reality of what has already been accomplished. Consider how this understanding would have threatened the early church authorities who ultimately banned this gospel. If cosmic redemption was universal in scope, if divine love operated beyond the boundaries of religious institutions, if transformation was accessible to anyone regardless of their theological sophistication, then what purpose did organized religion serve? The Gospel of Peter seemed to suggest that the most important spiritual realities couldn't be contained within human systems or controlled by religious hierarchies. That divine presence was too vast and too generous to be limited by the institutional frameworks that emerging Christianity was trying to establish. But the suppression of this gospel reveals something even more unsettling about how spiritual truth gets determined throughout history. The decision to exclude the Gospel of Peter from the biblical canon wasn't made by divine revelation or supernatural guidance. It was made by human beings with institutional agendas, political concerns, and practical limitations. Church councils in the 4th and 5th centuries faced enormous pressure to create unity among increasingly diverse Christian communities scattered across the Roman Empire. They needed clear doctrinal boundaries, manageable theological categories, and authorized texts that would support the religious structures they were trying to build. The wild cosmic vision of the Gospel of Peter didn't fit those requirements. It was too expansive, too inclusive, too transformative to be safely integrated into the systematic theology that institutional Christianity required for survival and growth. So this profound spiritual text was gradually marginalized, then actively condemned, then systematically destroyed. The communities that valued it were pressured to abandon it. The manuscripts that preserved it were allowed to decay or were deliberately burned. Within a few centuries, one of the most extraordinary visions of cosmic redemption ever recorded existed only in hostile references from church authorities explaining why it should be rejected. The loss was staggering, because the Gospel of Peter wasn't just another early Christian text with interesting historical details. It was a window into spiritual realities that transcended the limitations of human religious systems. It preserved insights about the nature of divine love that were too radical for institutional Christianity to embrace without undermining its own authority structures. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of this suppression is how it shaped the spiritual imagination of countless generations who never knew what they had lost. For over 1,500 years, Christians lived with truncated versions of the resurrection story. They inherited manageable accounts of divine victory that had been carefully edited to support institutional agendas rather than reveal the full magnitude of cosmic transformation. Imagine how different Christian consciousness might have developed if the Gospel of Peter had remained part of the canonical tradition. If believers had grown up with visions of giant resurrection figures bridging heaven and earth. If they had understood that divine love operated on scales that dwarfed every human attempt to contain or control it. The spiritual vitality of Christianity itself might have evolved along entirely different lines. Instead of focusing primarily on institutional loyalty and doctrinal conformity, Christian communities might have emphasized direct spiritual experience and cosmic transformation. Instead of creating barriers between the sacred and secular, they might have recognized that divine presence permeated all of reality. But the suppression succeeded so completely that most Christians today have never even heard of the Gospel of Peter. They've inherited a spirituality that has been systematically limited to exclude the most transformative insights that early Christian communities once preserved. This is why the archaeological recovery of this gospel in 1886 was more than just an interesting historical discovery. It was the resurrection of spiritual possibilities that religious authorities thought they had buried forever. It offered contemporary seekers access to cosmic visions that had been deemed too dangerous for previous generations. Yet even today, over a century after its recovery, the Gospel of Peter remains largely unknown to ordinary believers. It's studied in academic circles, debated by scholars, analyzed by historians. But it hasn't been integrated into the spiritual life of Christian communities in ways that would allow its transformative vision to flourish. This continued marginalization reveals how deeply the patterns of suppression have become embedded in religious consciousness. Even when forbidden texts become available, even when suppressed insights are recovered, the institutional momentum toward limitation and control continues to operate. Most religious leaders today don't actively condemn the Gospel of Peter the way their ancient predecessors did. They simply ignore it. They treat it as an interesting historical curiosity, rather than a potential source of spiritual renewal. They maintain the boundaries that early church authorities established without having to explicitly defend them. But for those who do encounter this forbidden gospel, who take the time to read its shocking claims and grapple with its cosmic vision, the experience can be spiritually revolutionary. Because it reveals that the familiar stories of crucifixion and resurrection were just the beginning of a transformation that was meant to continue until every dimension of existence had been renewed. The text forces readers to confront questions that most religious education carefully avoids. Questions about the true scope of divine love. Questions about the nature of human destiny. Questions about whether the spiritual realities we've been taught to accept as final might actually be preliminary stages in a cosmic process that we've barely begun to understand. These aren't comfortable questions because they challenge the foundations of religious certainty that many people depend on for psychological stability. They suggest that even our most cherished beliefs about salvation, redemption, and eternal life might be incomplete shadows of realities too magnificent for human language to adequately express. The Gospel of Peter doesn't offer easy answers or comfortable reassurances. Instead, it presents visions of cosmic transformation that expand our spiritual imagination beyond every familiar boundary. It challenges us to consider that divine love might operate according to principles far more generous and far-reaching than any human institution has been willing to acknowledge. This is why engaging with this forbidden gospel requires more than just intellectual curiosity. It demands spiritual courage, the willingness to have your existing beliefs challenged and potentially transformed. The openness to encounter possibilities that might revolutionize everything you thought you knew about the nature of existence itself. But for those who do have that courage, who are willing to follow the implications of the Gospel of Peter wherever they might lead, the rewards can be extraordinary. Because hidden within its shocking descriptions of giant resurrection figures and speaking crosses lies a vision of human potential that transcends every limitation that religious institutions have tried to impose. The text suggests that what happened in that tomb 2,000 years ago was just the first glimpse of what every human soul is ultimately destined to become. That the cosmic transformation it describes is still unfolding, still available, still offering possibilities for direct spiritual experience that don't depend on religious mediation or institutional approval. This perspective transforms the Gospel of Peter from ancient history into contemporary spiritual possibility. It suggests that the extraordinary events it describes weren't limited to a specific historical moment, but were the beginning of an ongoing process that continues to offer transformation to anyone willing to look beyond familiar interpretations. The speaking cross becomes more than just a miraculous event from the distant past. It becomes an ongoing proclamation that divine love operates beyond every boundary that human beings have tried to establish. A cosmic announcement that redemption extends to every soul that has ever carried the divine image, regardless of their religious background or theological sophistication. But accepting this perspective requires fundamental changes in how we understand the relationship between spiritual truth and religious authority. It challenges us to consider that the most important realities about existence might be accessible through direct experience rather than institutional instruction. That cosmic love might be far more immediate and personal than we've been taught to believe. The Gospel of Peter implies that every human being already carries within themselves everything necessary for direct relationship with divine reality, that the cosmic victory described in its pages has made it possible for ordinary people to experience extraordinary spiritual transformation without requiring permission from religious authorities or conformity to institutional expectations. This is both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it suggests that spiritual truth isn't locked away behind ecclesiastical barriers or limited to those with proper theological credentials. Terrifying because it places the responsibility for spiritual development directly on individual souls, rather than allowing them to depend on religious institutions for guidance and validation. The forbidden gospel challenges us to become spiritually mature in ways that most religious traditions don't encourage. Instead of remaining dependent on external authorities for interpretation of divine truth, it suggests that we can develop the capacity for direct spiritual discernment. Instead of accepting manageable versions of cosmic reality, it invites us to encounter the wild, transformative magnitude of divine love operating on scales that dwarf human understanding. But perhaps most significantly, the Gospel of Peter suggests that the familiar boundaries between sacred and secular, religious and ordinary, spiritual and material, were never meant to be permanent divisions. The cosmic transformation it describes was meant to permeate every dimension of existence until the entire universe became what that tomb was for 3 days, a place where heaven and earth intersected so completely that separation became impossible. This vision has profound implications for how we understand our daily lives, our relationships, our work, our struggles, and our hopes. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then every moment of human experience is potentially sacred. Every interaction is potentially transformative. Every challenge is potentially an opportunity for cosmic love to manifest in ways that transcend ordinary understanding. The text doesn't present this as religious theory or theological speculation. It claims to record it as eyewitness testimony to events that actually occurred and continue to influence reality at levels most people never recognize. It suggests that the spiritual transformation it describes is as real and immediate as the physical world we navigate every day. But recognizing this reality requires developing what the Gospel of Peter implies is every human being's birthright, the capacity to perceive spiritual dimensions of existence that operate simultaneously with material reality, the ability to recognize cosmic love expressing itself through ordinary circumstances, the sensitivity to detect divine presence operating within and through the natural world. These aren't mystical abilities reserved for specially gifted individuals. According to this forbidden gospel, they're natural human capacities that were restored through the cosmic victory achieved on the cross. They're spiritual senses that every soul possesses, but that most people never learn to use because religious institutions have convinced them that such direct experience is either impossible or dangerous. The Gospel of Peter challenges this institutional monopoly on spiritual experience by suggesting that cosmic transformation is meant to be personally encountered rather than simply believed, that the extraordinary events it describes created possibilities for direct spiritual perception that don't require religious mediation to access. This is why the text remains controversial even today, not because scholars have proven it false, but because its implications are so revolutionary that accepting them would require rebuilding our entire understanding of spiritual reality from the ground up. It challenges not just specific religious doctrines, but the very categories we use to think about divine action in the world. The forbidden gospel forces us to confront the possibility that the most important events in human history were even more cosmic and transformative than we've been taught to believe. That familiar religious frameworks, however beautiful and meaningful they might be, are still just human attempts to contain realities that transcend every institution's capacity to fully understand or adequately express. But it also suggests that those transcendent realities are not distant or inaccessible. The cosmic transformation described in the Gospel of Peter has made it possible for every human soul to participate directly in the divine life that was revealed through crucifixion and resurrection, not as passive recipients of religious instruction, but as active participants in ongoing cosmic renewal. The giant figure emerging from that tomb wasn't just Jesus returning to life. According to this banned text, it was the first manifestation of what every human being is ultimately destined to become when the full implications of cosmic love are finally realized in individual consciousness. The speaking cross wasn't just announcing historical victory over death, it was proclaiming ongoing possibilities for transformation that extend to every soul willing to embrace them. This perspective transforms everything. It suggests that what you've always understood as normal human existence is actually a preliminary stage in a cosmic process that has barely begun to unfold. That the limitations you've accepted as final might actually be temporary conditions that divine love is already in the process of transcending. The Gospel of Peter implies that every prayer you've ever offered, every moment of spiritual longing you've ever experienced, every sense you've ever had that existence must mean something more than material survival, has been a response to cosmic realities that are far more immediate and accessible than you've been taught to believe. But engaging with these possibilities requires more than just intellectual acceptance of extraordinary claims. It demands the kind of spiritual courage that the early church authorities feared would make religious institutions obsolete. The willingness to trust your own capacity for direct spiritual experience. The openness to encounter divine love operating on scales that transcend every familiar framework. The forbidden gospel suggests that this courage isn't optional for anyone who wants to understand the true significance of what happened on that cross and in that tomb. That the cosmic transformation it describes can only be fully appreciated by souls willing to participate in it personally, rather than simply observing it from the safe distance of religious doctrine. This is why the Gospel of Peter was banned. Not because it was false, but because it was too true to be safely contained within human institutions. Not because it undermined faith, but because it revealed that authentic faith was far more radical and transformative than most believers were prepared to embrace. The text that was meant to be lost forever has been recovered. The vision that was deemed too dangerous for previous generations is now available for examination without the institutional pressures that shaped early Christianity. The cosmic revelation that religious authorities tried to suppress has emerged from an Egyptian tomb to challenge everything we thought we knew about human potential and divine purpose. What we choose to do with this recovered wisdom will determine whether we remain content with manageable versions of spiritual truth, or whether we're prepared to encounter the wild, transformative reality that the Gospel of Peter claims has been available all along to anyone bold enough to look beyond familiar limitations and embrace the cosmic love that transcends every human attempt to contain it. The question isn't whether you're qualified to receive such transformation. According to this forbidden gospel, that question was settled 2,000 years ago in ways that extend to every soul that has ever carried the divine image. The only remaining question is whether you're willing to accept what has already been accomplished on your behalf and allow it to revolutionize everything you thought you knew about what it means to be human in a universe where heaven and earth have become inseparably united through cosmic love. But there's something else hidden in the Gospel of Peter that we haven't discussed yet. Something that makes its suppression even more tragic and its recovery even more urgent. Because buried within this forbidden text is a teaching about the nature of time itself that could transform how we understand not just resurrection, but every moment of human experience. The canonical Gospels describe time in human terms: minutes, hours, days, 3 days in the tomb, 40 days of post-resurrection appearances, linear, predictable, manageable. But the Gospel of Peter suggests something that would have shattered the religious worldview of the ancient world completely. According to this forbidden text, what happened during those 3 days wasn't just resurrection. It was the restructuring of temporal reality itself. The moments between death and emergence from the tomb didn't follow normal chronological patterns. They existed outside the stream of linear time, creating what the text describes as eternal moments that contained entire ages of spiritual activity. Think about the implications. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then the familiar timeline we use to understand the Passion narrative is completely inadequate. Those 3 days contained not just hours of waiting, but eons of cosmic transformation. Not just the restoration of one life, but the redemption of every soul that had ever existed across all of human history. The text describes Jesus' descent into the realm of the dead not as a brief visit, but as an eternal confrontation with the forces that had held humanity captive since the fall. Time itself became a battlefield where divine love waged war against every limitation that had ever separated souls from their Creator. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. The Gospel of Peter suggests that this temporal restructuring didn't end when Jesus emerged from the tomb. It created permanent alterations in how time functions for anyone who participates in resurrection reality. The text implies that souls touched by cosmic transformation begin to experience time differently, perceiving eternal dimensions within ordinary moments. This understanding completely transforms how we read other early Christian writings. When Paul speaks about being caught up to the third heaven, when John describes apocalyptic visions, when mystics throughout history report encounters with timeless reality, they might not be describing extraordinary exceptions to normal spiritual experience. They might be accessing temporal dimensions that the resurrection made permanently available to human consciousness. The Gospel of Peter doesn't present this as abstract theology. It claims to record specific observations of how resurrected existence operates beyond the constraints of linear time. The giant figure emerging from the tomb wasn't just physically transformed. According to this banned text, it existed simultaneously in multiple temporal dimensions, able to interact with past, present, and future as unified reality. Consider what this means for understanding the speaking cross. It wasn't just announcing that the gospel had been preached to the dead. It was proclaiming that temporal barriers between different eras of human history had been dissolved, that every soul who had ever lived could now receive redemption regardless of when they existed in linear time. This temporal revolution explains why early church authorities found the Gospel of Peter so threatening. If time itself had been transformed through resurrection, if eternal realities were accessible within ordinary moments, if the dead could receive salvation across temporal boundaries, then the entire framework of religious authority based on controlling access to divine truth became obsolete. The text suggests that cosmic transformation operates according to principles that transcend every human institution's capacity to regulate or contain. That divine love functions outside temporal limitations that religious hierarchies depend on to maintain their relevance and control. But perhaps most disturbing of all is what this implies about our current moment. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then the temporal restructuring it describes is still operating. The eternal dimensions made accessible through resurrection are still available. The cosmic transformation that began 2,000 years ago is still unfolding in ways that most people never recognize. Every moment of your existence might contain access to timeless reality that dwarfs your normal understanding of past, present, and future. Every prayer, every moment of spiritual longing, every sense that life must mean something beyond material survival might be touching temporal dimensions that were opened through cosmic victory over death itself. The Forbidden Gospel suggests that what you experience as ordinary time is actually the surface layer of multidimensional reality, where eternal and temporal intersect continuously. That the familiar sequence of moments you navigate daily exists within larger patterns of meaning that operate according to principles too vast for normal human consciousness to grasp. This perspective transforms everything about how we understand memory, hope, regret, anticipation, and presence. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then your past isn't fixed, your future isn't determined, and your present moment contains possibilities for transformation that transcend every limitation you've accepted as final. The text implies that resurrection reality doesn't just promise eternal life after death. It offers access to eternal dimensions within life itself. The ability to experience time as divine love experiences it, where every moment contains infinite possibility for healing, restoration, and cosmic renewal. But engaging with these temporal dimensions requires developing what the Gospel of Peter suggests is every human being's spiritual birthright: the capacity to perceive beyond the surface chronology of events into the eternal patterns that give them ultimate meaning. The sensitivity to recognize how divine love operates through ordinary circumstances to create possibilities that transcend normal cause and effect. This isn't mystical speculation or religious fantasy. According to this banned gospel, it's the natural result of cosmic transformation that made it possible for human consciousness to participate directly in the timeless awareness that characterizes divine existence itself. The giant figure emerging from that tomb wasn't just returning to life. It was demonstrating what every human soul looks like when it begins to operate from eternal rather than temporal perspective. When it starts to perceive reality as divine love perceives it, where past, present, and future exist as unified dimensions of ongoing creative activity. The speaking cross wasn't just making historical announcements. It was proclaiming that temporal limitations, which had seemed absolute, were actually temporary conditions that cosmic love had already transcended. That redemption operates outside the chronological boundaries that human beings use to organize their understanding of possibility and limitation. This temporal revolution has profound implications for how we understand suffering, loss, missed opportunities, and seemingly irreversible mistakes. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then divine love operates from eternal perspective where nothing is truly lost, no opportunity is permanently missed, no mistake is irreversibly damaging. The text suggests that what appears to be finished from temporal perspective might still be in process from eternal viewpoint. That healing, restoration, and transformation can occur across temporal boundaries that seem absolute to human understanding, but are permeable to cosmic love operating from timeless reality. But perhaps most significantly, the Gospel of Peter implies that this eternal perspective is not reserved for specially enlightened individuals or mystically gifted souls. It's the natural inheritance of everyone who carries the divine image, everyone who was created for relationship with the eternal, everyone who has ever sensed that they were made for more than mere chronological existence. The cosmic transformation described in this forbidden gospel made it possible for ordinary people to experience extraordinary temporal awareness, to perceive how their individual stories participate in larger patterns of meaning that span across generations and centuries, to recognize how their personal struggles and victories contribute to cosmic purposes that transcend their immediate circumstances. This understanding transforms prayer from petition into participation. Instead of asking divine love to intervene in temporal circumstances from some distant eternal realm, prayer becomes conscious engagement with timeless reality that's already operating within every moment. It becomes alignment with cosmic purposes that are always unfolding through ordinary events in ways that most people never recognize. The Gospel of Peter suggests that every human being already has access to the eternal dimensions that were opened through resurrection. That the temporal restructuring it describes isn't something that happened long ago in distant times and places. It's an ongoing reality that's available for direct experience by anyone willing to look beyond surface chronology into the deeper patterns where divine love expresses itself through the apparent randomness of everyday circumstances. But recognizing these eternal dimensions requires spiritual courage that most religious traditions don't cultivate. The willingness to trust your own capacity for temporal transcendence. The openness to discover that your individual existence participates in cosmic purposes far more magnificent than you've been taught to believe possible. The Forbidden Gospel challenges us to consider that what we call normal human experience might actually be preliminary awareness of multidimensional reality, where time functions according to principles that dwarf our familiar understanding of sequence and duration. That the limitations we accept as final might be temporary conditions that divine love is already in the process of transforming through ongoing cosmic renewal. This is why the Gospel of Peter was suppressed. Not because its claims about temporal restructuring were obviously false, but because they were too true to be safely integrated into religious institutions that depended on controlling access to divine truth through chronological frameworks that could be managed and regulated. If time itself had been transformed through resurrection, if eternal dimensions were accessible within ordinary moments, if cosmic love operated beyond temporal limitations that religious authorities needed to maintain their relevance, then what purpose did institutional Christianity serve in mediating between souls and timeless reality? The text that was banned for being too radical about the nature of time has been recovered. The vision that was deemed too dangerous regarding temporal transformation is now available for examination. The cosmic revelation about restructured reality that church authorities tried to suppress has emerged to challenge everything we thought we knew about how divine love operates within and beyond the constraints of linear chronology. What we choose to do with this recovered wisdom about time and eternity will determine whether we remain trapped within surface chronology or whether we're prepared to discover the timeless dimensions that the Gospel of Peter claims have been available all along to anyone bold enough to look beyond familiar temporal limitations. The question isn't whether you're qualified to access eternal awareness. According to this forbidden gospel, that capacity was restored through cosmic transformation that extends to every soul created for relationship with the timeless. The only remaining question is whether you're willing to recognize that every moment of your existence already contains access to the restructured temporal reality that makes ordinary time a doorway into infinite possibility. But as we continue to uncover the layers of this forbidden gospel, we encounter something that makes its suppression even more disturbing. Because hidden within the Gospel of Peter is a teaching about the nature of consciousness itself, that anticipated discoveries modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. Something that suggests the early church didn't just ban a historical document. They suppressed insights into human potential that could have revolutionized our understanding of what it means to be conscious beings in a conscious universe. The canonical Gospels describe the resurrection in terms of physical restoration, a dead body returning to life, empty tomb, wounded hands, the ability to eat fish and break bread. These are profound testimonies to divine power over death, certainly, but they present resurrection within familiar categories of embodied existence that don't challenge our basic assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The Gospel of Peter describes something far more radical. According to this banned text, what emerged from that tomb wasn't just a restored physical body. It was consciousness itself transformed into something that transcended the normal boundaries between individual awareness and cosmic reality. The giant figure wasn't just physically enlarged. It was consciousness expanded beyond every limitation that had previously defined human mental experience. Think about what this implies. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then resurrection wasn't just victory over physical death. It was the transformation of consciousness itself from individual, isolated awareness into something that could exist simultaneously at multiple levels of reality. Personal identity that somehow contained cosmic awareness. Individual consciousness that participated directly in universal consciousness without losing its unique characteristics. This understanding makes sense of details in the Gospel of Peter that seem bizarre when read through familiar religious frameworks. The resurrected figure reaching above the clouds isn't just physical gigantism. It's consciousness extended beyond the normal boundaries of embodied awareness. The ability to be supported by heavenly beings isn't just supernatural assistance. It's consciousness operating from multiple dimensions simultaneously. But here's where it gets truly revolutionary. The Gospel of Peter suggests that this transformation of consciousness wasn't unique to Jesus. It was a preview of what every human being's awareness is ultimately destined to become. The cosmic figure emerging from the tomb was demonstrating the natural evolution of consciousness when it's no longer limited by the fear of death or separation from divine reality. The text implies that what we experience as normal human consciousness is actually a contracted state, a temporary limitation imposed by identification with physical mortality and individual isolation. But the cosmic transformation achieved through crucifixion and resurrection made it possible for human awareness to expand beyond these artificial constraints into its original cosmic nature. Consider how this understanding transforms every aspect of spiritual experience. Prayer becomes more than petition to external divine authority. It becomes conscious participation in the universal awareness that's already operating through individual consciousness. Meditation becomes more than mental discipline. It becomes recognition of the cosmic consciousness that's always available beneath surface thoughts and emotions. The Gospel of Peter suggests that every moment of expanded awareness you've ever experienced, every sense of connection with something larger than individual identity, every intuitive insight that seemed to come from beyond normal reasoning has been a glimpse of the consciousness transformation that resurrection made permanently accessible to human experience. But recognizing this requires understanding something that modern religious education rarely addresses: the difference between consciousness and awareness itself. Consciousness in this context refers to the individual stream of thoughts, emotions, memories, and sensations that create personal identity. Awareness refers to the deeper capacity that observes consciousness, the unchanging presence within which all mental activity occurs. The Gospel of Peter suggests that resurrection consciousness operates from awareness rather than from the contents of individual consciousness. It's able to experience thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being limited by them. It can participate in individual identity without being trapped within its boundaries. It can engage with physical reality without being confined by material limitations. This perspective explains why the resurrected figure in the Gospel of Peter could interact with physical disciples while simultaneously existing at cosmic scales. Consciousness operating from pure awareness can function at multiple levels of reality without contradiction. It can be intimately personal while remaining universally connected. But perhaps most significantly, this understanding suggests that the consciousness transformation described in the Gospel of Peter is not just a historical event to be remembered. It's ongoing possibility that's available for direct experience by anyone willing to shift their identity from individual consciousness to the universal awareness that's always been their deepest nature. The forbidden gospel implies that what you call your normal state of consciousness is actually a case of mistaken identity. You've learned to identify yourself with the stream of thoughts and emotions that flows through awareness, rather than with the awareness itself. But the cosmic transformation achieved through resurrection made it possible to recognize your true identity as the awareness within which all conscious experience occurs. This isn't abstract philosophy or mystical speculation. According to the Gospel of Peter, it's practical reality that becomes accessible when consciousness is no longer limited by fear of death or separation from divine reality. When awareness recognizes its own cosmic nature, individual identity becomes expression of universal consciousness rather than barrier to it. The giant figure emerging from that tomb wasn't just Jesus returning to life. It was human consciousness itself demonstrating what becomes possible when awareness recognizes its unlimited nature. When individual identity expands to embrace its cosmic dimensions without losing its personal characteristics. The speaking cross wasn't just making theological announcements. It was consciousness itself proclaiming that the barriers between individual and universal awareness had been dissolved. That every soul could now access the cosmic consciousness that had always been their deepest identity, but had been obscured by identification with limited, mortal self-concepts. This consciousness revolution has profound implications for understanding human potential that extend far beyond religious doctrine into realms of psychology, neuroscience, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. If the Gospel of Peter is accurate, then what we call normal human consciousness is actually a restricted version of awareness that's capable of unlimited expansion when it's no longer constrained by fear and separation. Modern neuroscience is beginning to discover what this forbidden gospel claimed 2,000 years ago. That consciousness is not produced by the brain, but appears to be a fundamental feature of reality itself. That individual awareness might be localized expressions of universal consciousness rather than isolated phenomena generated by neural activity. The Gospel of Peter anticipated these discoveries by suggesting that resurrection consciousness operates from the recognition that individual awareness and cosmic awareness are different expressions of the same fundamental reality. That what appears to be separate, isolated consciousness is actually universal awareness experiencing itself from countless unique perspectives simultaneously. But accepting this understanding requires fundamental shifts in how we think about personal identity, individual responsibility, and the relationship between human consciousness and divine reality. It challenges the assumption that you are your thoughts, emotions, memories, and sensations. Instead, it suggests that you are the awareness within which all these mental phenomena appear and disappear. This perspective transforms suffering from personal tragedy into temporary experience within consciousness that remains fundamentally unharmed by any mental or physical condition. It transforms death from ultimate threat into transition within awareness that continues regardless of changes in individual consciousness. It transforms spiritual seeking from attempt to acquire something external into recognition of what has always been your deepest nature. The Gospel of Peter suggests that this recognition of true identity as universal awareness is not mystical achievement reserved for specially gifted individuals. It's the natural result of consciousness no longer being limited by identification with mortality and separation. It's what becomes possible when awareness recognizes its own cosmic nature through the transformation that resurrection made available to human experience. This is why the text was so threatening to early church authorities. If individual consciousness was actually expression of universal awareness, if resurrection consciousness was accessible through direct recognition rather than religious mediation, if cosmic identity was every human being's natural inheritance, then what purpose did institutional Christianity serve in controlling access to divine reality? The Gospel of Peter seemed to suggest that the most important spiritual transformation couldn't be contained within human religious systems or regulated by ecclesiastical authorities, that consciousness itself was too vast and immediate to be limited by doctrinal frameworks or institutional hierarchies. But the suppression of this consciousness teaching has had devastating consequences for human spiritual development that extend far beyond religious doctrine. For nearly 2,000 years, Western civilization has operated from the assumption that consciousness is individual, isolated, and produced by material processes. This assumption has shaped psychology, philosophy, science, and social organization in ways that reinforce separation and limitation rather than recognizing the cosmic awareness that's actually our deepest nature. The recovery of the Gospel of Peter offers unprecedented opportunity to reconsider these fundamental assumptions about consciousness and identity, to explore what becomes possible when awareness recognizes its unlimited nature, to discover how individual consciousness can expand into cosmic dimensions without losing its unique characteristics. But engaging with these possibilities requires spiritual courage that most people have never been encouraged to develop. The willingness to question your most basic assumptions about who and what you are. The openness to discover that your individual identity might be far more vast and connected than you've been taught to believe. The Forbidden Gospel challenges us to consider that what we call normal human consciousness might actually be contracted awareness that's forgotten its cosmic nature, that the limitations we accept as defining characteristics of human experience might be temporary conditions that divine love is already in the process of dissolving through ongoing transformation of consciousness itself. The giant figure emerging from that tomb wasn't just demonstrating physical resurrection. According to the Gospel of Peter, it was consciousness itself revealing what becomes possible when awareness is no longer limited by identification with mortality, isolation, and individual self-concepts. When recognition dawns that every human being is actually universal consciousness experiencing itself from unique, personal perspectives. This consciousness transformation is not just ancient history or future possibility. The Gospel of Peter suggests it's available right now for anyone willing to shift their identity from the contents of consciousness to the awareness within which all conscious experience occurs, from individual thoughts and emotions to the unchanging presence that observes all mental activity without being limited by any of it. The question isn't whether you're qualified for such consciousness transformation. According to this banned text, cosmic awareness is already your deepest nature, waiting to be recognized beneath the surface activity of individual consciousness. The only remaining question is whether you're prepared to discover who you really are when awareness recognizes its own unlimited cosmic dimensions. But as we approach the final revelation hidden within the Gospel of Peter, we encounter something that makes its suppression the greatest spiritual tragedy in human history. Because this forbidden text doesn't just preserve alternative accounts of ancient events or different theological perspectives. It contains specific instructions for accessing the consciousness transformation it describes. Practical guidance for recognizing cosmic awareness that early church authorities deemed too dangerous for human beings to possess. The instructions buried within these forbidden pages weren't abstract spiritual concepts or philosophical meditations. They were precise techniques for what the Gospel of Peter calls awakening the inner witness, the capacity to perceive spiritual realities that operate simultaneously with physical events. Methods that early church authorities recognized would make every believer capable of direct spiritual discernment without requiring institutional guidance or approval. Consider what this means. If ordinary people could develop the same consciousness that witnessed the cosmic resurrection, if they could learn to perceive the speaking cross that still proclaims redemption across temporal boundaries, if they could recognize the giant figure of transformed awareness within their own spiritual experience, then the entire structure of religious mediation would become obsolete. The Gospel of Peter describes these techniques with the clinical precision of someone recording actual practices that produced measurable results. Not vague spiritual aspirations, but specific methods for expanding awareness beyond normal limitations. Ways of breathing, focusing attention and shifting identity that could trigger the same consciousness transformation that made cosmic perception possible for the original witnesses. But here's what makes these instructions so revolutionary. They don't require special religious credentials, theological education, or institutional approval. According to this banned text, they work through direct application of principles that operate regardless of belief systems, cultural backgrounds, or spiritual sophistication. They're based on the fundamental structure of a consciousness itself, rather than particular religious frameworks. The text describes what it calls the practice of eternal presence, a way of maintaining awareness that exists beyond the stream of thoughts, emotions, and sensations that normally define individual consciousness. When this presence is stabilized, according to the Gospel of Peter, perception automatically begins to expand beyond physical limitations into the cosmic dimensions where resurrection events continue to unfold. Think about the implications. The Gospel of Peter suggests that what the guards witnessed at the tomb wasn't just historical miracle occurring in distant time and place. It was manifestation of spiritual realities that remain accessible to anyone who develops the consciousness to perceive them. The giant figure emerging from death into cosmic life wasn't just ancient event to be remembered. It's ongoing transformation that can be directly experienced through proper spiritual practice. The text provides detailed descriptions of what it calls the 7 depths of witnessing, progressive stages of awareness expansion that allow consciousness to perceive increasingly subtle dimensions of spiritual reality. Starting with basic recognition of awareness itself, moving through stages of temporal transcendence, and culminating in what the Gospel of Peter describes as cosmic sight, the ability to perceive divine love operating through all circumstances simultaneously. But perhaps most remarkably, these instructions include specific guidance for what the text calls resurrection breathing, techniques that allegedly allow consciousness to experience the same expansion that characterized the emergence from the tomb. Methods of using breath to dissolve the boundaries between individual awareness and universal consciousness, creating direct access to the cosmic perspective from which resurrection operates. The Gospel of Peter claims these practices don't just produce temporary spiritual experiences. They create permanent alterations in how consciousness functions, enabling ongoing access to the eternal dimensions that were opened through cosmic transformation. Practitioners develop what the text describes as double sight, the ability to perceive both ordinary physical reality and the spiritual patterns that give it ultimate meaning simultaneously. Now you understand why early church authorities were absolutely terrified of this gospel. It wasn't just preserving alternative theological perspectives or different historical accounts. It was providing practical instructions that could make every believer spiritually independent, methods that could enable direct access to the cosmic realities that institutional Christianity claimed only trained clergy could properly understand and interpret. If these practices actually worked, if ordinary people could develop resurrection consciousness through direct application of specific techniques, then what purpose did religious hierarchies serve? Why would anyone need priestly mediation when they could access divine reality directly? How could institutional authority survive when cosmic transformation became personally available through practical spiritual methods? The suppression of these instructions represents one of the greatest losses in human spiritual history. For nearly 2,000 years, techniques that could potentially revolutionize human consciousness have been buried beneath institutional fears about uncontrolled spiritual development. Practices that might enable ordinary people to experience the same cosmic awareness that made resurrection perception possible have been lost to all but the most dedicated scholars of suppressed texts. But the recovery of the Gospel of Peter offers unprecedented opportunity to reclaim this lost spiritual technology, to experiment with practices that early church authorities deemed too powerful for general distribution, to discover whether consciousness really can be expanded beyond normal limitations through specific techniques that operate regardless of religious beliefs or institutional approval. The text provides remarkably detailed guidance for what it calls the discipline of cosmic remembering, methods for accessing the eternal perspective from which all temporal events can be perceived as expressions of ongoing divine creative activity, practices that allegedly enable consciousness to recognize its own participation in the universal awareness that's always operating through individual experience. According to the Gospel of Peter, these techniques work by dissolving the artificial barriers that separate individual consciousness from cosmic consciousness. When practiced consistently, they create what the text describes as transparent awareness, consciousness that can experience personal identity without being limited by individual boundaries, awareness that participates in both human and divine perspectives simultaneously. The instructions include specific guidance for different temperaments and spiritual dispositions. Some people, according to this forbidden gospel, develop cosmic consciousness most readily through practices that emphasize love and devotion. Others find expansion through methods that focus on understanding and discrimination. Still others access universal awareness through techniques that cultivate surrender and receptivity to divine guidance. But regardless of individual approach, the Gospel of Peter insists that all authentic spiritual practice leads toward the same fundamental recognition: that what you've always experienced as separate individual consciousness is actually universal awareness experiencing itself from countless unique perspectives simultaneously. That resurrection consciousness is simply awareness recognizing its own cosmic nature. The text describes the moment of this recognition as the Great Awakening, a sudden shift in identity from individual consciousness, struggling with limitations, to cosmic awareness expressing itself through individual form. When this shift occurs, according to the Gospel of Peter, all spiritual seeking ends because consciousness recognizes it has always been what it was seeking to become. This awakening, the text claims, creates the same expansion of perception that enabled witnesses to see the giant figure emerging from the tomb, the same consciousness that could hear the speaking cross proclaiming cosmic redemption, the same awareness that could perceive resurrection as ongoing transformation rather than historical event limited to past time and distant place. But perhaps most significantly, the Gospel of Peter suggests that this awakening doesn't separate consciousness from ordinary human experience. Instead, it transforms how everyday activities are perceived and experienced. Work becomes expression of cosmic creativity. Relationships become opportunities for divine love to recognize itself through human interaction. Even suffering becomes participation in the ongoing transformation that's dissolving every limitation that separates souls from their ultimate nature. The Forbidden Gospel describes practitioners who have stabilized this cosmic consciousness as the hidden resurrection community. Individuals who appear to live ordinary lives, but who actually operate from awareness that has been permanently expanded beyond normal human limitations. They function as bridges between temporal reality and eternal dimensions, making cosmic love accessible through their presence and activities without necessarily advertising their spiritual development. These individuals, according to the text, don't need religious institutions to validate their spiritual insights because they have direct access to the same divine awareness that created and sustains all reality. They don't require external authorities to interpret cosmic truth because they can perceive it directly through their expanded consciousness. They don't depend on institutional approval, because their identity has shifted from individual ego to universal awareness itself. This creates what the Gospel of Peter describes as the true church, not an organization with buildings and hierarchies, but a living network of consciousness that has recognized its cosmic nature. A community united not by shared beliefs or common practices, but by mutual recognition of the universal awareness that expresses itself through all authentic spiritual development. The text suggests that this true church operates largely invisibly within and alongside institutional religions, providing spiritual vitality that keeps traditional forms alive even when their official doctrines have become rigid or corrupt. Its members serve as secret leaven, introducing cosmic consciousness into religious communities that have forgotten their original purpose of facilitating direct divine encounter. But the Gospel of Peter also warns that accessing these practices requires spiritual maturity that most people haven't developed. The techniques it describes can be dangerous when applied by consciousness that's still primarily identified with individual ego rather than universal awareness. They can produce spiritual experiences that ego attempts to claim as personal achievements, leading to inflation and delusion rather than genuine transformation. This is why the text emphasizes the absolute necessity of what it calls ego death, the dissolution of identification with individual consciousness that must occur before cosmic awareness can be safely accessed. Without this preliminary purification, the practices described in the Gospel of Peter can strengthen ego rather than transcending it, creating spiritual pride rather than genuine humility before cosmic mystery. The instructions include detailed guidance for recognizing and navigating these spiritual pitfalls, methods for distinguishing between authentic expansion of consciousness and ego inflation masquerading as spiritual development, practices for maintaining proper relationship between individual identity and cosmic awareness as consciousness learns to operate from both levels simultaneously. But for those who do approach these techniques with adequate preparation and genuine spiritual maturity, the Gospel of Peter promises transformation that transcends every limitation that normally defines human experience. Access to the same cosmic consciousness that perceived resurrection as ongoing reality rather than historical event. Recognition of divine love operating through every circumstance as expression of ultimate purpose that transcends individual understanding. The Forbidden Gospel suggests that this transformation is not just personal spiritual achievement. It's participation in collective evolution of human consciousness toward recognition of its own cosmic nature. Each individual who awakens to universal awareness contributes to global shift toward recognition that separation between human and divine is artificial to the text, is what resurrection was limitation rather than ultimate reality. This collective awakening, according always intended to accomplish not just individual salvation from death, but species-wide recognition of consciousness that transcends mortality altogether. The giant figure emerging from the tomb was preview of what humanity itself is destined to become when enough individuals recognize their cosmic nature to trigger collective transformation. The speaking cross continues to proclaim this possibility, according to the Gospel of Peter. Its message of cosmic redemption extends not just to souls who lived and died in past centuries, but to current and future generations who will discover their own capacity for resurrection consciousness through direct spiritual practice rather than institutional mediation. The Gospel of Peter forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. For 2,000 years, we may have inherited only fragments of the most important story ever told. The cosmic resurrection it describes, the speaking cross that proclaims redemption across time itself, the consciousness transformation that makes divine awareness accessible to ordinary people. These aren't just ancient curiosities. They're invitations to discover spiritual realities that institutional Christianity deemed too dangerous to preserve. Tonight, we've uncovered a text that was meant to stay buried forever. We've explored visions of resurrection so magnificent they challenge the very foundations of religious authority. We've discovered practices for expanding consciousness that early church leaders feared would make their institutions obsolete. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation isn't what the Gospel of Peter tells us about ancient events. It's what it suggests about the spiritual possibilities that have been systematically hidden from us. If this forbidden gospel preserves authentic insights into cosmic transformation, if its practices really can expand consciousness beyond normal limitations, if resurrection is ongoing reality rather than historical memory, then everything we thought we knew about human potential needs to be reconsidered. The question isn't whether you believe every extraordinary claim in this banned text. The question is whether you're willing to consider that the truth about the cross, the tomb, and what emerged from it might be far more wonderful and far more accessible than you've ever been allowed to imagine. The gospel that was lost has been found. The vision that was suppressed has been recovered. The consciousness transformation that was deemed too dangerous for previous generations is now available for anyone bold enough to explore what lies beyond familiar religious boundaries. What you choose to do with these forbidden revelations will determine whether you remain content with manageable versions of spiritual truth, or whether you're prepared to encounter the wild, cosmic reality that the Gospel of Peter claims has been waiting all along for souls courageous enough to receive it. The speaking cross is still proclaiming its message of universal redemption. The question that remains is simple. Are you ready to hear it?